So we saw in the last video that the Second World War broke out in September 1939, or as one student remembered it, the proverbial chickens laid by the poor peace treaties after World War I all came home to roast. So the chickens coming home to roast, not roost, as is the traditional saying. So Germany and the Soviet Union very quickly swallow up Poland. I mean, I mentioned that as part of the Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact, they had a secret deal that they would divide Poland between them. So after Hitler invades Poland in 1939, the Soviets quickly attack in the east, and within about a month, Poland has been thoroughly defeated, with the British and French really unable to do an awful lot to help the Poles because of geography. I mean, obviously, the British and French were simply not able to send soldiers to Poland. What followed after this was what we sometimes call the phony war. So between September 1939 and April 1940, there was very little real fighting taking place in the West. Germany was kind of on the one hand building up its forces to prepare for an attack in Western Europe in 1940. The British and French were a little kind of unsure of their kind of tactical objectives. I mean, the only reason they declared war in September 1939 was to defend Poland. After Poland had been defeated, a lot of people in Britain and France kind of wondered, well, what's the point now? I mean, we were supposed to protect Poland. We failed to protect Poland. Is it really worth carrying on the war? The French in particular, since the First World War, had been planning for a defensive war against Germany. During the 1930s, they constructed something called the Maginot Line, which was a powerful series of fortresses along the French and German border. And so the French, essentially, their position was if war is to be fought against Germany, we would rather fight it defensively. We would rather fight the Germans force the Germans to fight on our terms. And therefore, they didn't take any kind of strategic initiative or launch an offensive war against Germany. So essentially, the French and the British were waiting for the Germans to make a move, if they would make a move. Some people consider the possibility that there might be some kind of negotiated settlement. That is not to say that there was no conflict between September and April 1940. The Soviet Union invaded Finland for its own strategic purposes. The British and French had considered whether to help the Soviet Union or help the Finnish, against the Soviet Union, but did not do so. And Finland, after putting up actually considerable stubborn resistance to the Soviets in what is known as the Winter War. I mean, basically everyone expected the Soviets to conquer Finland quite quickly, but the Finns had been able to resist despite the fact they did not have a very large military for several months. Then, in April 1940, the Nazis launched their attack in the West. They firstly conquered Denmark and Norway in April of 1940, and then launched a massive offensive against the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in May of 1940. One of the kind of unfair criticisms of the French during the Second World War is that they built the Maginot Line and didn't kind of prepare for the Germans to simply go around it, because obviously the Germans, didn't attack the Maginot Line. They had attacked, they outflanked the Maginot Line. That was always the French plan. The French had basically figured that we're going to build a strong defensive line along the border between France and Germany. And what they were hoping was that would force the Germans to attack through Belgium, as they had done during the First World War. With the idea for the French being that they could stop the Germans in Belgium, stop them getting into France and kind of just destroying the same, or inflicting the same damage on the French countryside that they had during the First World War. So it was always a plan from the French point of view that the Germans would go around the Maginot Line. The problem was that when the Maginot Line was being constructed, one area that was left kind of weak on its northern flank was around the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes forest was, obviously as the name suggests, a forest. It was also quite hilly terrain. And in early 1930, when the Maginot Line was being constructed, the idea was, well, tanks could not move through this terrain. It was true in 1930. But by 1940, the Germans had made enough advancements with their tank technology that they could move an army through the Ardennes. And the French had kind of thought that the Germans might attack through the Ardennes, but they figured that if they did, they would have to do so very slowly. So it was actually the speed of the Germans coming through an unexpected point of attack is what caught the French flat-footed. Also, what the French had done was that, again, they'd been planning for the Germans to attack through Belgium, So after the Germans, when the Germans basically attacked the Netherlands and Belgium, the French and the British considered this was the main German invasion force of France as well. And so the British and French sent most of their army into Belgium to confront the German threat. And instead, the Germans broke into France further south at the Ardennes and were able to actually cut off, essentially, the French and the Germans came through the Ardennes and headed straight for the North Sea, trapping the British and French army in Belgium. In other words, they undercut the British and French army from the south, cut them off from Paris, and essentially surrounded them. So France, that was why France was essentially overrun. They were tactically outmaneuvered by the Germans. This forced a massive evacuation of the Allied soldiers from Dunkirk. Dunkirk, obviously, on the North Sea, where Belgium is. Dunkirk itself is in France, but close to the Belgian border. That's where the British army and the remnants of the French army evacuated to Britain, and essentially leaving France defenseless and totally outmaneuvered. So France was essentially conquered. The French government, under a war hero from the First World War called Marshal Philippe Pétain, signed an armistice with the Germans where they agreed that the Germans could occupy the strategic points of France so long as the war with Britain continued. And what that essentially meant was the Atlantic coast of France, mostly the northern 3/5 of France. The southern 2/5 were left in the hands of a semi-independent government. It was called the Vichy government. It was supposed to be actually only a temporary measure. The French and the Germans both expected that the British would either be conquered quickly or would just make peace with the Germans, and therefore that the French government would retake control over most of France. But as the war continued for another 5 years, the Germans held on to that territory for the duration of the war, or at least until it could be reconquered by the Allies. Britain was left by itself, alone. The Germans, who hadn't actually originally considered conquering Britain, now changed their plans to include an invasion of the United Kingdom. But in order to do so, they knew they would have to defeat the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, in order to allow for smooth travel of the German fleet to transport soldiers across the English Channel into Britain. So what resulted, starting in July 1940, was the Battle of Britain. For the next 4 months, British and German air forces battled for kind of supremacy of the skies over the English Channel to determine whether or not the Germans would be able to invade Britain. British had better planes. They had faster planes. They were able to replace their lost planes more quickly. So the British Air Force took a heavy toll. It lost 650 planes in this time period, but it was able to inflict greater casualties on the Germans. And by September 1940, Hitler essentially realized that the German Luftwaffe Air Force was not strong enough to defeat the British, and therefore he would have to postpone his invasion plans of the United Kingdom. So the main war of the First World War is going to be fought in the East. Hitler had always planned to protect the Soviet Union. So even though Hitler had made a non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union in 1939, he'd always planned to kind of renege on this and attack the Soviet Union, because that was part of his plan for Lebensraum. Remember I mentioned earlier on, this large body of living space he wanted to carve out of Poland and today what is Ukraine and Western Russia. So on June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler, the Germans launched their massive invasion of the Soviet Union, what's known as Operation Barbarossa, named after a medieval German king. And the Germans were pretty confident of victory. They had kind of assumed, once the Soviet Union had struggled to defeat the Finns in 1939-1940, the Germans had figured that they would simply be far too strong for the Soviet Union. They really hadn't done much reconnaissance on the strength of the Soviet army. They expected that the Soviets would be defeated very easily. On top of that, Stalin had purged, as we saw in an earlier lecture, most of the leadership from the Soviet Union, purged most of the leadership from the Soviet military in the late 1930s, which meant that they had lost most of their most effective commanders. Stalin himself genuinely didn't expect a German attack. He figured that there could be some kind of meaningful alliance between the Nazis and the Soviets. He had frankly had a nervous breakdown, disappeared for a couple of days after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union. And so initially it looks like this war is going to go very badly for the Soviet Union. The Germans capture huge amounts of territory. So by the end of 1941, the Germans have captured about 1 million square miles of Soviet territory. They inflict enormous casualties upon the Soviets, who initially are poorly led, are not trained very well, and are unable to resist the German advancement into the Soviet Union. But the Germans have actually badly miscalculated about the kind of durability and economic and industrial capabilities of the Soviet Union. They firstly find that as they begin, frankly, slaughtering Soviet civilians, that resistance to them grows stronger over the course of 1941-1942. They're also surprised to find out that the Soviets are much better prepared for war than Russia was during the First World War. We mentioned during we talked about the First World War that the Russians in 1914-1918 simply were much more poorly armed than the Germans. That was not true in 1940-1941. Stalin's 5-year plans, while they inflicted enormous suffering upon the people of the Soviet Union, the one upside of them was that the Soviets had developed the capacity to make a large number of very effective weapons of war: tanks, guns, artillery pieces, airplanes. And oftentimes the quality of these, especially in tanks, was actually superior to what the Germans had. The Germans did not expect that. The German advance stalled. The weather also played an important role. The winter of 1941 was probably the worst winter in Russia in the 20th century, and the Germans had not planned for a long winter campaign. I mean, in their kind of arrogance, the German commanders had not brought warm or cold weather clothing, had not prepared their machines. I mean, the Germans didn't bring antifreeze, which they needed when gasoline started freezing in the tanks. So a combination of the industrial output of the Soviet Union, the resilience of the people, and the weather served to stall the Nazi invasion. So the Nazis, for example, they get within 20 miles of Moscow in December 1941, but they are turned back. They surround Leningrad, which used to be St. Petersburg, but are unable to conquer it. In fact, Leningrad holds out for over 500 days before it is eventually relieved by Soviet forces. So the war in the East ends up being the stumbling block for the Nazis and the beginning of reversal of fortunes for them. And this reversal is most obviously noticeable in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942. The Nazis surround Stalingrad in November of 1942. They believe they're about to capture the city. They don't realize that the Russians have actually built up an enormous force inside of Stalingrad. Hitler actually takes away some of his soldiers and transfers them back north. And then suddenly the Soviets break out of Stalingrad and completely surround the Nazis who were there. Hitler orders the Nazis not to surrender, to fight on to the last man. But eventually the Nazi army is forced to surrender, which is a devastating loss for the Germans. This large Nazi army is captured. It was the first clear, humiliating defeat for the Nazis during the Second World War, and very much marks a key turning point in the war. After Stalingrad in 1942, the war in the East between the Nazis and the Soviets is going to be one in which the Nazis are in constant retreat in the face of overwhelming Soviet, not just Soviet numbers, but Soviet military and technological superiority to the Nazis as well. So Stalingrad 1942, key turning point in the Second World War.